Hello and welcome to the kickoff of the Technology and Innovation Center series, part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. As you join the Zoom and get settled, please, I welcome you to share your name, role, and organization in the chat. I'm loving seeing where everyone's from already. So please, we'll start to get settled in and get to a sense of who else is in the room. My name is Tina Walla, and I'm the interim CEO at US Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides pro bono technology support to governments. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's, to the first in a new series today, the Technology and Innovation Center series, that aims to inspire local government leaders about the integration of technology that's going to improve city infrastructure for decades to come. The series is a part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. Launched in June, the Local Infrastructure Hub is a partnership of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, Results for America, and Delivery Associates. The purpose of this initiative is to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of the historic infrastructure funding by providing mayors and their senior staff with information to help them create competitive, winning bids for bipartisan infrastructure law funding. And we think about this and we get really excited when we think about that funding delivering real results for residents, tangible results that we can all feel and see. This session today is brought to you by Cornell Tech and US Digital Response and is supported by our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. I'd like to take a moment to orient you to this series and to give you a sense of how we're approaching it. This series is guided by 4 key values. First, the Technology and Innovation Center series is driven by shared goals. We do not believe in technology for technology's sake, but rather see the need and the critical role that participatory processes play in shaping the technology that will affect our communities in the years to come. Second, we want to design for people. We are not all the same. And we want to think about how technology products need to reflect the needs and desires of the deeply diverse groups and individuals who use them. Third, we believe so strongly in approaching this work with an eye towards resourcing the work in the long term. We right now are in this incredible moment where there's a lot of federal funding, but we know that governments don't think in 1 or 2 year timeframes. All of you in your communities are thinking about the long term, and so are we, as we think about the workforce needed to maintain and enhance these technologies, policies, and then also thinking about things like regulation. And last but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Technology must be reliable, transparent, secure, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. And so with these 4 core values that I've just described, I want to share with you quickly why I'm personally so excited about this series. Before I joined US Digital Response, I was a chief innovation officer in the city of Seattle for 6 years. And I still remember when the bipartisan infrastructure law passed. For those of us in and around government, it was so exciting. And it was also so daunting to think about how to make the most of this moment. I am so excited for this series to be a helpful resource to all of you to build your knowledge and confidence around the technologies that are going to play an important role in the years to come and that will add value to you and your residents. As such, we've designed this series to bring you information both on upcoming NOFOs, like our January session that I'll tell you about later, but also on cross-functional topics that we believe are going to enhance your ability to have that cross-departmental collaboration that we know is so important with opportunities like this. Now, as I hand it over to my friend Anthony Townsend from Cornell Tech, we want to take a quick poll of all of you and to understand what knowledge you're bringing to this conversation. So that poll is going to pop up in just a moment and ask you how you would assess your understanding of nature-based solutions as we start off our conversation. Don't be shy. I'll tell you how I would rate my understanding, and it's not high. I'm no expert. So I'm really excited to learn from our speakers today. Thank you for taking a moment to vote. And Anthony, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tina, for that introduction to the series as well as the topic of the day. I'm going to answer the poll myself as we get started. Just looking through the chat, everyone that's checked in, I think it's safe to say that we probably have a group of people here, some of whom are experts, some of whom are hearing about nature-based solutions for the first time. So I'd like to begin by just reviewing how FEMA and the federal government think about nature-based solutions, which is really the basis for the two NOFOs that we're focusing today's discussion around. So you see that right here, the cover of Building Community Resilience, which with Nature-Based Solutions, Guide for Local Communities. This was the document that was released in September with the BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, and this year's Flood Mitigation Assistance Notices of Funding. And in that document, FEMA defines nature-based solutions with three main points. The first is how they're done, through sustainable planning, design, environmental management, and engineering practices. The second is really what they do. They combine natural features and processes with built ones. And the third is how they do it, or sorry, excuse me, why they do it, to reduce risk, to conserve ecosystem value and functions, and to provide associated benefits to human populations. Can I have the next slide, please? So go back one, please. It's a lot easier to understand what we're talking about through examples. And FEMA identifies three categories of nature-based solutions. And these are, for the most part, aimed at managing flood risks, although these interventions also do provide other benefits to communities than just managing floods. And the three scales are the watershed scale, the neighborhood or site scale, and along coasts. And they identify in that document about a dozen different types of nature-based solutions that really capture sort of where the excitement is around this approach. Everything at the watershed scale, from floodplain restoration to developing stormwater parks. These are parks that are designed to flood and absorb excess water during severe rainfall events. At the neighborhood site scale, familiar ideas to many, I'm sure, like green roofs, permeable pavements, and just simply planting trees to increase the tree canopy. And along coasts, we see interventions like fortifying dunes or restoring oyster reefs. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at the NOFOs for the BRIC and the FMA programs this year, and go to the technical evaluation criteria, you'll see something new. You'll see that incorporation of nature-based solutions for hazard mitigation is a pretty important item in the technical evaluation criteria for both of those programs. So we're moving into a regime now where not incorporating nature-based solutions is going to put your proposals at a distinct disadvantage. It's sort of 10 easy points. When my kids take tests, I make sure, write your name on the test because you get 10 points for writing your name. So this is something that we really need to think about as part of our strategy. Next slide, please. Now, nature-based solutions are innovative, moving away from the approach in the past, which has been really to kind of pour concrete over things that are problems, and has proven to create its own set of problems. And this is really a strategy that tries to green all that gray stuff that we built in the 20th century. Doing so, embracing natural elements in these big flood management projects makes them more resilient, and it also makes them more sustainable. But one of the interesting things is that the shift away from these kind of heavy, hard engineered approaches has tended to downplay the role of technology in at least the way these projects are portrayed. Next slide, please. And one of the things that has started to become clear, and this was articulated last month in a major report that was issued by the White House at the Global Climate Conference, COP27, is that leaving technology in the dust when we shift back to a nature-based approach is actually a missed opportunity. And they go to great pains in this report to make it clear that their policy is that technology and nature-based solutions can be powerful allies. And that if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we really have to deploy all of the proven science and evidence-based solutions that we have available to us. Next slide, please. So then the big question becomes, how do we leverage technology to deliver nature-based solutions without, as Tina so clearly laid out in the beginning, putting technology first and having technology drive the agenda. And we see three ways this can happen that are really surprising, again, because these projects are so much about returning to the basics of using nature to solve our problems. Next slide, please. So the first set of approaches is using technology to decide which nature-based solution you want to pursue in the first place. And a great example of this actually comes from the EU, the European Union, where the Urban Green Up program produced a very easy to use tool. You can go to this address and download this spreadsheet, which has a bunch of macros that allow it to basically take your answers to about 50 questions about the resources and constraints available in your city or your community. And it will pour through a list of about 100 different nature-based solutions and score them and rank them based on your answers to those questions. So it's sort of giving you a punch list of which nature-based solutions are best matched to your community, and also a list of potential obstacles. And you can see I went through and did sort of a sample of this, and based on my responses, it turns out that we need to work on the morale of our team, apparently, in order to pursue some of these solutions. But this is a really useful way, if you haven't already done this, to get a quick kind of screening of what's available. Next slide, please. I think when we get into the meat of how technology can be used to deliver nature-based solutions, it's helpful to think about sort of levels of intensity or levels of maturity. And this is a framework that we're going to use throughout the Technology and Innovation Center series, which consists of 3 levels, really. The first is state of the art. So that's technology solutions you can buy today. For instance, the city of Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan deployed a nature-based solution along the Sioux River to automate lock controls and allow water to move into one of the basins along the river more regularly and improve that area as a fish habitat and restore the fish habitat. This uses off-the-shelf technology. A good example of the next level of maturity, what we call next generation. And this is really technology that's coming out of the labs or has just been invented. In Fort Pierce, Florida, there was a nature-based approach was taken to restoring shellfish populations, which do all kinds of great things to filter water. And that used a 3D printed artificial reef structure to provide an ideal location for those organisms to kind of attach. And then the third level of maturity, what we call a moonshot. This is technology that needs to be invented or developed and deployed often over long periods of time, over a generation. And one of the things I love about technology demos is if you break them, that's just confirmation that you're really pushing the bleeding edge of technology. It looks like our video isn't working right now, but this is a depiction of a what we call a digital twin of the urban tree canopy in New York City that we've been developing here at Cornell Tech that will allow the city to model and simulate some of the benefits that trees provide, both through shading and air pollution mitigation. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the third way that technology can help deliver nature-based solutions is by quantifying the benefits of nature-based solutions. The World Economic Forum estimates that nature-based solutions are up to 50% more cost-effective than the old ways, the gray alternatives, but have received less than 1% of global spending on urban infrastructure. And the simple reason for that is not just that they're new, it's that there aren't broadly accepted standards for quantifying the benefits. And the US Army Corps of Engineers, at the direction of Congress and the Biden administration, has just in the last year released a new set of guidelines and protocols for helping the engineering community really assess the full set of economic, environmental, and social benefits of nature-based solutions. But this is new. There's lots of different ways of doing it, and that's our focus today, because this is information that you can use right now if you're going to be pursuing these grants and want to make a strong case both to FEMA as well as to your own constituents about the sort of cost benefit efficiency of a nature-based solution. Could I have the next slide, please? And so we've brought together a group of speakers who are going to share their experiences from the field, working in cities around the country, and really zero in on this question of how we measure the costs and benefits of nature-based solutions and make the case. First, we'll have Eamon Duckworth, who's Senior Landscape Architect and Urban Ecologist at Biohabitats. We'll have Andy Shively, Deputy Director at KC Water in the city of Kansas City, Missouri. And then Tamar Warburg, Director of Sustainability, and Chris Hardy, Senior Associate at Sasaki Associates. Now, they'll each have 10 minutes to share some of their insights, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And we'll hold questions until the end and deal with them as a group. As speakers go along, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat room. And so let's begin with Eamon to hear about how designers and ecologists think about measuring these benefits of nature-based solutions.
Good afternoon. My name is Eamon Duckworth, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about tools for assessing the benefits of nature-based solutions. Next slide. Biohabitats is a multidisciplinary company that focuses exclusively on conservation planning, ecological restoration, and regenerative design. And we do that work through multiple scales: at planning, at regional, municipal, and watershed scales, and site planning, design, and implementation. Next slide. Our work engages with some of the major challenges for our planet and our communities, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental justice. Next slide. In evaluating how nature-based solutions are meeting those and other challenges, we apply an ecological benefits analysis approach. It's rooted in the ecosystem services concept that you see on the left, which we have translated to the framework that you see on the right of social, cultural, climate, air, soil, water, and biodiversity and habitat. I'll be giving a brief review of some of the tools we use for assessing some of these categories. Next slide. We use a variety of technology tools and approaches for ecological benefits analysis, from geospatial tools to modeling to monitoring. And that work can apply at various phases of a project: early with planning and suitability analysis, through to monitoring performance after implementation. And we match tools and approaches and their level of detail and complexity to the needs of each specific project. Next slide. For the city of Atlanta, we developed an urban ecology framework plan applying a social ecological approach, and that work included geospatial analysis under the categories of habitat and biodiversity, ecosystem services, parks and open space, and environmental and climate justice. Next slide. We use socioeconomic data and historic land use and policy patterns to identify areas of high social vulnerability that were also lacking in key urban ecological benefits, understanding patterns of inequity in the city, and proposing nature-based solutions to match to those specific needs. Next slide. Community engagement is also critical to issues of equity and environmental justice, and we often use web-based mapping and survey tools as one method of gathering input and data directly from the public. Next slide. For water, we frequently apply modeling tools such as HEC-RAS 2D. As with many of our modeling approaches, we can model flooding under existing conditions, conditions under predicted future development and climate change, and assess where nature-based solutions might be the most beneficial for flood reduction. Then we can implement planned interventions and rerun the model to quantify flood reduction benefits. Next slide. High-performance computing costs have come down significantly in recent years, and that's allowed more affordable use of more complex and higher resolution modeling on more projects. For shoreline and coastal projects, such as this proposed living breakwater for the city of Charleston, we can model hydrodynamics in 3 dimensions with programs such as Delft 3D. We can quantify storm surge reductions. We can also look at aspects of water quality improvement. And these kinds of modeling tools help make the case for living shorelines and other green infrastructure solutions that enhance ecological function. Gray infrastructure solutions can often be much easier to calculate from an engineering perspective. Next slide. When looking at biodiversity benefits, we often assess habitat connectivity and how a project can best enhance a green living infrastructure network beyond an individual project site. In this example from our work with the City of Atlanta, on the left, high resolution pixels in green and red indicate the relative resistance to species movement. In darker red, you can see buildings and major road patterns in plan view. We can then model species movement through that landscape, shown on the right in shades of blue-green and with major habitat corridors in yellow-green. So these tools can help assess site suitability and quantify improvements to habitat connectivity. Next slide. Biodiversity at its core is about species diversity. Technology increasingly helps us understand species presence and diversity at various scales. Camera traps can document species presence through photos. Tools like the Audio Moth can collect animal sounds like bird calls and spring peepers. That data can be run through programs like BirdNet to identify species. Community science tools like eBird and iNaturalist can provide a wealth of data about species presence in a municipality or on a site, and can encourage community engagement with urban nature. Next slide. Increasingly, our planning, design, and assessment of nature-based solutions includes climate risk assessment. For the City of Austin, with Blackland Collaborative and RES, we are currently assessing their park system for climate threats that include fire, extreme heat, drought, and flooding, with remote top-down approaches and through on-the-ground bottom-up approaches combined in a geospatial analysis. And we're developing recommendations for management to make their urban ecosystems more resilient to future climate change. One key project goal here in Austin is fire risk reduction while also enhancing ecological health. Next slide. I saw recently for the first time a municipal RFP with federal grant funding for a green flood and stormwater infrastructure, also with a focus specifically on reducing heat island effects in socially vulnerable communities. So heat island existing conditions can be assessed and quantified through remote sensing, as shown in this example from Austin, with ground-based sensors, or through a combination of the two. Next slide. Predictive modeling can be used to assess proposed conditions. So this example using the Invest Urban Cooling model uses geospatial data, climate data, and empirical inputs to calculate temperature changes from proposed conditions. Next slide. Fire risk and simulated fire events can also be modeled, a major focus for US Western states. This shows some outputs from the Flame Map program that combines climate, topography, vegetation, and land surface conditions to model fire risk at varying scales. Next slide. Carbon is also an increasing topic in our work. We're currently supporting the City of Boulder with a land-based carbon inventory and natural climate solutions plan. The plan will also be setting up pilot projects to monitor and measure outcomes. The city is very interested in a Boulder-specific analysis that leverages some on-the-ground data. So this model is a combination of remote sensing, site-measured data, and empirical references. We're also using the US Forest Service Forest Vegetation Simulator with site-specific data to assess forest carbon dynamics. On other projects with different needs, we might apply the iTree suite of tools, the Pathfinder app, or the excellent Sasaki Carbon Conscious app, which I think you'll hear more about shortly. Next slide. We're also increasingly focused on the carbon footprint of nature-based solutions. So how does the carbon debt from implementation compare to carbon sequestration? How are we maximizing social ecological benefit in relation to that initial carbon debt? This stream and floodplain restoration example from our work in Annapolis, Maryland was innovative in not using stone for stabilization, but using only wood, and only wood reused from the site. So there were a number of drivers for that approach, but a co-benefit was a significantly reduced carbon footprint for the project. Next slide. Finally, a monitoring example, the Georgia Tech Eco Commons in Atlanta, where we supported Barge and Nelson Bird Woltz, landscape architects. The primary purpose of this project was turning an old parking lot into a campus green space. It's also serving important stormwater management and water reuse functions for the campus. Next slide. Another role that Eco Commons serves is as a living laboratory or designed experiment for understanding performance of the site and design elements in relation to the project's sustainability and resilience goals. And it will also inform design and management of other open spaces on campus in the future. In the design phase, we looked at a number of metrics, which you'll see on the far left of the diagram. We applied a reference landscape approach of comparing the Eco Commons ecological performance to a mature Piedmont forest. So the habitat that was present on the site prior to the creation of Atlanta and might represent the ideal natural ecological performance. We also compared the site to a traditional trees and lawn landscape on campus. And then we assessed the predicted successional trajectory of the eco-commons landscape. So how close to the performance of mature forest can this campus open space get? Next slide. The installed site design employs a number of sensors and proposed surveys to measure its site conditions over time for microclimate, soil, water, habitat, and social wellness. And the research framework also calls for censoring and measurement of the comparative landscapes. Next slide. And this living laboratory framework is an interpretive feature of the site through signage, through visible sensor elements, and via this online dashboard. And now the sensors are in place. Georgia Tech is implementing an adaptive landscape management plan that we developed, and we were all excited to see the results over time and see how they compare to our predictive modeling and site design performance. Next slide. I'll close with some suggestions for pursuing federal funding, tying the work to major local and global issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental justice, having a plan and process for meaningful community engagement, focusing on stacked benefits, recognizing that we can't solve for just one problem in this work, measuring what matters to the community. Every project can't do a deep dive on every theme, but what best reflects the community's needs? And are you demonstrating that you understand those needs? Establish quantifiable metrics to measure success. And is there a master plan? A greater community vision and assessment of suitability for what you propose, a bigger picture, longer term plan. And have you selected the best site and the best project for what you are proposing? Next slide. Thanks very much for having me here virtually to speak with you all. And I look forward to any discussion in this call or in the future. Thanks very much.
Eamon, thank you so much. It's fascinating to me to see sensors, supercomputers, and satellites all deployed to support nature-based solutions in cities around the country. Right now, I want to jump over to Kansas City, Missouri, and welcome Andy Shively, who's Deputy Director of KC Water, to talk about how Kansas City is putting technology and nature-based solutions to work. Andy?
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. First of all, the city of Kansas City, Missouri is very appreciative of this opportunity to join this webinar, and we feel very honored and privileged to be here and share with you what we have implemented in Kansas City, and we hope that all can benefit. Maybe just a little bit. I know I've already learned from Mr. Duckworth's presentation, and we all should learn every day, and I know I learn something new every day, and so we're very appreciative. Just a little bit. You can go ahead and throw up the first slide if you don't mind. Kansas City Water Smart Sewer Program. So in 2010, September 27, 2010, the city of Kansas City, Missouri entered into its federal consent decree to be compliant with the Federal Clean Water Act. And so my presentation today, our presentation is based up from that perspective, being compliant with our federal consent decree and managing those dollars associated with that consent decree. Because when it was entered in 2010, I started managing the overflow control program in 2012. So our program to manage overflows was called the Overflow Control Program. So, but I knew we needed to take a different look at it. Plus, engineers are not very creative. The program is just Overflow Control Program. But since we were going to take a different look at how we're going to manage our Overflow Control Program, we went through a branding session. One of the first things we wanted to do, because there's a lot of new infrastructure proposed in the federal consent decree. It's like $4.5 to $5 billion consent decree, and a lot of raising of rates to accommodate that level of investment in new infrastructure. And those rising rates also would cause rate fatigue with our constituents, our residents here that live in Kansas City. So it doesn't take a very good crystal ball, just a little bit of math looking ahead to say our residents are going to be really unhappy in like 10 years. Well, it didn't even take 10 years before then to be unhappy with the rising rates to support a $4.5 to $5 billion program. So we needed to step back and look and say, hey, rather than building a bunch of new gray infrastructure or new infrastructure, maybe we should look at using what we have to the maximum extent possible. and maintaining what we have. Why don't we actually fix what we have and use what we have before we build a bunch of new infrastructure that frankly would probably not be maintained. So hence through the rebranding effort, it was named the Smart Sewer Program, no longer just the Overflow Control Program. And so we wanted to maximize the use of our existing infrastructure and do so in such a way that we're addressing our overflows. And that's just one of the, and then invest in what we already had built. And so another thing we did, and it wasn't included in today's because it wasn't a nature-based solution. We deployed a smart sewer sensor network. And at one time, Kansas City had the world's largest smart sewer sensor network to learn how our system operated. And what we learned is that our system operated better than what we thought. And so we built that model through the use of our smart sewer sensor network. And we use that information to help drive the capital improvements program. So it's like, hey, it also identified inline storage opportunities, back to that premise. Hey, why don't we use what we already have built to the maximum extent possible? If this sewer has storage capacity during an event, why don't we put in a gate with some real-time control and utilize that asset? So that's just another example. And so now that I've sufficiently bored everybody with teeing up with the background, and I'll try not to use acronyms. You know, engineers are horrible about using acronyms. I think you could have entire conversations with just acronyms. So I'll try to steer away from that. I know that with my son texting, I very seldom get a full word out of him. It's just an acronym of something. So I'll go on to the next slide, please. So CMAQ, Continuous Monitoring and Adaptive Control, and Gardner Avenue Detention Basin. That was an existing detention basin that at the control point, the valve was just left open. That was its really smart control system. Is we built the basin and just left the valve in the open position. That way it filled up and drained out immediately. So that's not a very smart use of that Gardner Avenue detention basin. So we looked at utilizing CMAQ, Continuous Monitoring and Adaptive Control. You can go on to the next slide. What is CMAQ? It uses the NOAA weather data and says, hey, here's this upcoming storm. Maybe the valve needs to be completely closed, maybe just 10% open, and we can measure the water level, and we'll actually utilize the detention basin to the maximum extent possible. So that's what CMAQ does. So we used Opti real-time control, Opti RTCs. You see that up in the upper right-hand side of the slide, and have used that on several of our detention basins. I think Gardner Avenue is a 65-acre drainage area, captured up to 80 million gallons of what have otherwise been overflow. And the cost, which is what I really like about it, because we're utilizing something that's already built, is about a penny per gallon for control. So from a public standpoint, when you can address an overflow for a penny a gallon, that is a very wise use of your ratepayers' money, of your constituents' money. And so from an elected official standpoint, that's a very good conversation that they can have with their constituents out in the community, that their departments are doing everything they can to control rising costs. And I know their water bill's high, but they're doing everything they can to keep that leveled off. So you can go on to the next slide. And so how does it do that? It, rather than just looking back at historical storms and using those design storms from the history, it actually looks forward. So it's forward looking rather than just backwards looking in that information. So it takes that information in real time and trims it. So, and that big hump would normally be in the uncontrolled discharge without using the CMAQ. And then by using the Opti solution, you see how that's shaved, that it hold that volume in and then slowly releases, so it's not discharged to the environment. So no wet weather discharge. And again, just the cost, I can't speak highly enough of it, because very seldom do you as an owner sitting on our side of the table get a solution that only costs a penny per gallon because we already had the asset there. And we've also built new assets, new detention, new nature-based solutions, and we're going to get to those in just a little bit, utilizing the similar technology. So not just on existing, it was like, hey, let's build more and do the same thing because that makes sense. So you can go on to the next slide. So this is the Gardner Avenue we've been talking about. Before the retrofit, it was just a basin. It was empty because the valve was left always open. We did the retrofit. You can see the little, looks like solar panel and that control panel there that does the thinking. That's the brains behind the operation, if you will. And then when it's actually being utilized properly, it kind of looks like what it is on the right, which is a dramatic difference because it's holding a certain percentage and then releasing it when it needs to release it in anticipation of the upcoming storm. And it also kind of it greened up the area because moisture is being held and then released. And so it helped us, the city of Kansas City, spend our dollars more wisely elsewhere. And that's coming up because we have new projects coming up later in the presentation. You can go on to the next slide. Here's a new project, Paseo Gateway, currently under construction. It's a little smaller watershed, about 35 acres. You can go on to the next slide. And an example of kind of a public-private partnership because the control measure, the detention basin is actually being built on private property. And we worked with our our Parks and Recreation Department because the Paseo is a boulevard and they're the operating authority on our boulevards and parks. Learn that we do a lot of work with our Parks and Recreation Department because real estate is really hard to come by in a developed area. And where you do have green space is in parks. And so we have done a lot of look at the parks as a possible solution and benefit to all, benefit to the Parks Department, benefit to the city, benefit to the environment, to clean streams and how we can improve. And so this is a new project where we're using that adaptive, continuous monitoring and adaptive control. You can go on to the next slide. A trolley trail. This one is already constructed. It's a new detention basin on park property, and we tied it into the trolley trail. So it's called the trolley trail storage basin. That's grass detention basin, same control holds. I will note that this is probably one of my favorite projects because within the consent decree, it called for a 24-inch relief sewer. So it's linear construction. The diversion structure that the discharge was into it, discharge actually right into the public park. And that's what the relief sewer, the gray construction only, was going to address. It's going to take that overflow volume and ship it on down into the system to a larger interceptor. So rather than building linear construction, a gray solution, we went back and looked and said, hey, instead of spending $12 million for a new 24-inch sanitary sewer through roads, actually in a commercial area, let's see what we can do on this park property and it ended up coming in under $3 million, save money, improve the park, became a community amenity and did it for less money and he uses that real-time control. So the CMAQ. And so because there's such a problem, I mean, having CSOs in a public park, not a good thing. Something needed to be done. And then using a nature-based solution with technology and did so at an overall lower cost than what's traditionally just looked at. What's the gray infrastructure solution? That's why I really like this one. And plus the community benefit to tie into the trolley trail. And the park wasn't being used for anything. That was all treed. I did take a little bit of flack for cutting down trees to build that basin. I would actually say I took a lot of flack from the community initially, but I promised them they would be happy when I was done. And in the end, they were very happy and they asked if I would take down more trees. And this was, which is quite funny because in the public meeting, they wanted to take me out back to the woodshed and give me what for cutting down trees. It seemed to them that I was harming the environment by cutting down trees and not actually trying to improve the environment through this project. And I said, it is a happy marriage. You're just going to have to trust me. And so in the end, it's like I said, one of my favorite, because they couldn't be seen. And plus it displaced a gray infrastructure solution only with nature-based and technology with community enhancement. So you can go on to the next one, please. Next slide. And so this just kind of explains how it works. Very similar to the Gardner Avenue. I won't bore you with all of that, but it's the same principle. And we built the detention basin specifically to use technology to control that nature-based solution. And it's zero discharge. The basin now handles that flow. So we're pretty pleased with the overall performance and cost to this solution. You can go on to the
Andy, this is Anthony. I was wondering if we could stop there and
Okay.
just jump over to our guests from Sasaki so that we have a chance for them to share their material.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're running a little bit short on time.
I'm happy to abdicate the screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's a great example of some of the challenges that cities face putting nature-based solutions to work in communities. That story about cutting down the trees, I think, is really telling. So our final guests today are Tamar Warburg and Chris Hardy from Sasaki. And if possible, you guys could try to wrap up by 2:50. That would help us just have some time for the group to field some questions. Thank you.
Yes, we can. As a private firm that does planning, working for cities like Kansas City and others, but planning and architecture and landscape, we realized there was a gap on the market and decided to try to develop a carbon conscience application that could measure the carbon impact of different design solutions from the earliest planning phase. Next slide. So how do we quantify our impact on climate change? And then how do we take those lessons learned and design with a carbon conscience? Next slide. We all know that global carbon emissions, more than half of them are from the built environment, right? From operational energy, the carbon released by energy is 28% of those carbon emissions. And the carbon from materials in both architecture and landscape is another almost quarter of our carbon emissions. Next slide. And just to explain what that means, right? Embodied carbon emissions are emitted throughout the entire lifespan of a material, from the time it's mined, extracted, harvested, till the time it's assembled or manufactured, brought to the site, installed, and then eventually disassembled. Next slide. As planners, we are looking for sources of information. We did a whole literature search looking for data from planning, data from architecture, data from landscape, from whatever infrastructure we could find, and integrating all of that so that when we do site planning, whether you're a city planner, urban designer, developer, you can understand the holistic impact a project is having on the environment. Next slide. Now, when is it the right time to start thinking about this? Almost from before there's a project, right? You have to start planning from the very beginning, because otherwise there's never enough time and never enough opportunity for impact. Next slide. So we have to consider this from the earliest design phases, because the plans we make are going to affect the next generations, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. And it's important to get in early and have that impact early. Next slide. Because of course, the biggest impact we have is at the earliest design phases, as we're composing the site plan, figuring out what our land uses are going to be, how tall are our buildings, what materials are our landscapes, what are all these buildings and landscapes made of. That's when we have the biggest opportunity for impact. As it goes along, of course, your opportunities are less and less. Next slide. So we put together a research team to start to develop this for our own internal purposes, and now we're going public for all of you. And I'd like to introduce Chris Hardy, who is our project manager and a landscape architect for this, to walk us through the opportunities for you.
slide. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, we often think about water and stormwater treatment, stormwater mitigation, and flood control events. But another massive area where we tend to undervalue the living landscape is in the carbon cycle. And right now, there are many ideas and speculative thoughts for carbon sequestering technologies that are either not economically viable or are purely speculative. The only thing that we know how to do for certain right now is planting, is reforestation and restoration ecology projects. And as a landscape architect, it's a great pleasure that we get to work with the carbon cycle to our advantage to try to net sequester on projects. Next slide. When we talk about carbon sequestration, we're talking about the drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it up in the landscape, either through living tissue of vegetation or in dead tissue and biomass that's accumulated in that ecosystem or in the soils. And just as you can think about not all buildings are the same and not all structural systems and materials are the same, not all ecosystems are the same in terms of their performance, especially from a carbon perspective. And actually, a lot of the ecosystems that have the highest performance capacity for thinking about stormwater treatment and resiliency planning, such as salt marshes, freshwater wetlands, mangroves, those same ecosystems are actually the highest carbon sequestering ecosystems that you can plan for. Next slide. And when we talk about whole project carbon, we're very good at talking about in the sustainable design sector about net zero. And usually when we talk about that, we're talking about operations. That's how much carbon it costs to operate the facility. We can design net zero. We know how to do that. We know how to set goal setting for that and how to have regulatory support for that. What we're just starting to think about is how do we think about embodied? And when you look at the lifespan of most projects, about 50% of the total lifespan emissions of a project is in the embodied carbon. So we need to think about how we can offset embodied carbon with carbon sequestration and then target net operational carbon zero through renewable energy sources. Next. When we think about new projects, land use decisions have a huge impact. If we're talking about changing the FAR of a project or talking about priorities for preservation of a landscape, that can sometimes change in terms of order of magnitude the embodied carbon impacts of a project. So being able to sketch these things out and understand them early in the design process can really help move the dial in a way that modifying specifications later in the project can't. Next. Oh, the video can't be loaded. There's a great example video, but basically we've made an application that distills a literature review in a way that's made public for people to use, that you can sketch out different land uses, or you can upload a shapefile or a JPEG, and you can attach land uses to different kinds of data sets and then test and iterate on it. Next slide.
If we have time at the end, we can share our screens and PowerPoint and show you the videos.
So what we've done is we created a land use database that people can apply to their projects. There's about 200 or so landscape land uses that are both constructed landscapes and restored ecosystem typologies and preservation, and about 400 architectural land uses when you look at the different options you can combine. So this application allows you to test at a planning scale different types of urban design footprints and to see where you end up with in terms of your carbon budget for a project. Next. So we've been applying this to our project here in Hellinikon in Athens, as well as some of our projects domestically here in the United States. And it's been transformational in terms of how we talk to regulatory groups, but also to advocate for different kinds of solutions, but also to client teams. Next slide. And I bet this won't load. So the whole point of the app is to not necessarily give you an accurate accounting of what it will be, but it's going to give you projected potential, high and low embodied carbon, as well as carbon stored in the architecture and landscape, as well as carbon sequestered over a period of 60 years. And to allow you to test, to iterate, and to think critically about what you're proposing in your projects. Next slide. So what this does is it lets us inform our really early decisions with data, and so that we can start advocating for things like the amount of trees that we want to keep in the project and try not to have them removed over time in VE, or to advocate for maybe alternative material standards of a local municipality. Maybe concrete sidewalks isn't the default that we should all be going to. Next slide. And we found that that early goal setting really builds capital for commitment with both clients and communities. So if they understand it and they're talking about it from the beginning. And in terms of thinking about grant applications, if we start thinking about carbon in our grant applications and we can have numbers applied to that in a way that's easy and is not time expensive to do for a grant writer, then we can start building in those narratives from the very beginning, from the prospectus of what a project might be. Next. So that early goal setting can help us maintain the intent when we go to material and detail decisions, maybe accept alternative aesthetics or alternative materials than what might be normal or might be high carbon in that local marketplace. Next. And when we design for carbon impact, that really allows us to treat carbon just like we treat our monetary budgets. Is it worth the investment of what we're doing? Next. We're responsible for what we design, and every design has a carbon impact. I think something that's critical to think about in resiliency planning these days is about how are we building our way out of climate change? And is the way that we're building our way out of climate change contributing more harm than it's mitigating? And are there ways that we can consider offsetting that either locally within an individual municipality, like having a carbon fund for projects? If you're building a certain amount of projects, does it invest in a certain amount of urban greening? Or maybe regionally, connecting municipalities with their rural areas around them and promoting reforestation efforts. So sorry, I think I went over. Next. I think that's it for us.
Excellent. Chris, thank you so much. And everyone, I mean, I think you can tell by the amount of information here. We just heard a lot about the various combinations of technology that can be brought together, can be brought to bear together to enable nature-based solutions. We heard about the opportunity for public-private partnerships to bring this work to life in your communities. And we got a ton of real-world examples. So now we would love, if you have questions, drop them in the chat and we'll invite you to come off mute. I'm going to invite off the bat, Dave Gatton. I saw a question you had put in the chat and would welcome you. Come off mute and pose your question to our speakers.
Hello, I'm with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I wanted to ask Andy what kind of process he went through in modifying his consent decree to enable him to do these green projects. Because my understanding is if you're operating under a current consent decree, that is not an easy process, and perhaps some of the other panelists could describe their challenges in this area, because that's key to being able to implement off of existing footprints.
You are correct. It's a huge challenge once you've signed a consent decree and the judge has signed it. It's to make any modification is a challenge, and so. And the first thing I thought of when I heard you pose the question, what does it take? And it takes years of blood, sweat, and tears to get through that modification. We were at the negotiation table with the EPA, the DOJ, the enforcement branch. 2 years for the major modification that includes adaptive management. And so it is quite the process to change what you are, because that's the big thing. You're changing what you already agreed to. And that is not easy to undo.
But you're changing to something better
Agreed.
and more affordable. And EPA has developed, I believe, an integrated planning process and affordability measure. It's still difficult to implement, but it might give people a leg to stand on.
True. And through our last modification, an adaptive management approach, because you know what the technology today, one of the arguments made, the technology today is not going to be the technology in 5 years. So the consent decree goes to 2035 and 2040, and you want me to have a crystal ball that says I could only use CMAQ or RTDSS or, but we have no idea what's going to come about technology wise or what will be developed over the next 15 years. And so we need to have built-in flexibility so we can build the right project at the right time. not just what the crystal ball says in 2018, because in 2019 it'll look different, and in 2020 and so forth. So you are right, sir. It's still a difficult process. I hope it gets easier with time as the EPA implements other measures to facilitate the process.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, David, for your question. I'm going to invite each of our speakers to answer one last question that I have. We're going to sort of go lightning round, I suppose. And speakers, here's your question. What advice would you give to the cities who are on today's call about, that cities are right now, they're about halfway through the period of preparing proposals to FEMA's BRIC program and FMA programs. What single piece of advice, so we can keep this brief and end on time, would you give the cities that we have on today's call? And let me start with Eamon. Can I invite you to get us started?
Sure. I think I went over a few tips, but I think maybe the major one I would highlight is that we're seeing most frequently, even with some of our the clients and their work and what they're hearing from agencies is, this notion of stacked benefits to the community, and that even with the nature-based solutions approach, there's this tendency to, okay, well, it's a flooding project, so I'm solving for flooding. There's always a main driver, and different regions and different municipalities can have a major driver, but our landscapes and our solutions of today can't just function in that kind of monoculture. So that would be my main recommendation, is really extend as far as you can to consider how you're affecting all of the aspects and how that relates to what the community needs.
Thank you, Eamon. Andy, would love to hear advice as a city leader yourself.
It's along the same lines as Eamon is going to integrated public infrastructure improvement, where we bring each of the departments to the table: Public Works, Parks and Rec, trash collection. I put trash bins and recycling bins out on one of my green infrastructure projects, distributed them to the homeowners, to the neighborhood, and keeping those solids and floatables out of the improvements. And so it's that integrated public infrastructure approach to stack benefits, which Eamon, where you're solving multiple issues with the same dollar across the board. And that would be my advice.
Thank you. And finally, Chris or Tamara, whichever of you would love to share some advice.
Go for it, Chris, and I'll wrap.
I was going to say something very similar to Eamon, which is when you're going for a grant for a particular project, you can put on many different hats for what it can potentially function as. And so if you're thinking stormwater, think also carbon, think also potential fire mitigation and other strategies, and just be creative about the many different ways you can tell the story about the same project.
Thank you.
And think about carbon as a way to prevent climate change, right? And if developers if you can start asking people to track their embodied carbon emissions from projects, and they can't reach zero carbon, they don't have enough landscape area for an urban infill project, ask them to pay into a fund for ecological restoration elsewhere in the municipality, right? If we think big, if we think like urban planners and urban designers, are there opportunities that we can start to look at a city system as a whole, including perhaps a built-up core downtown with peripheral areas and park systems and resilience challenges.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and to the folks who are from cities who are here. If you don't have another meeting to run off to, we're going to keep this channel open for as long as our speakers can stay and talk. So don't feel like you have to run. We are not going to shut down in a moment, but I do want to give you a sense of what's to come in our series. We're going to share a couple of poll questions right now to get your feedback and thoughts on today's session. We're going to take that feedback and it's going to inform future sessions. And while you're responding to that poll, let me give you a sense of coming attractions. We'll be following up with an email with resources from our speakers and on this topic. And you can find those resources as well as a recording of today's webinar and so much more on the Local Infrastructure Hub website. If you haven't checked it out yet, please do. There's a ton of information there. And so all of this information that we'll have coming out of today's session will be on the Local Infrastructure Hub website. I want to share our next Technology and Innovation Center series session Fair Paths to EV Charging will be on Wednesday, January 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. And we're going to be looking at how cities are tackling the need for greater equity in the rollout of EV charging infrastructure. I really hope we'll see you then and that you'll bring some colleagues with you who would benefit from the discussion. Lastly, I want to share that next Tuesday, December 13th, is the Local Infrastructure Hub's next Delivering Results workshop, focused on the U.S. Department of Transportation RAISE program, and it'll also have a look ahead at DOT 2023 funding opportunities. We'll drop a link to register for that session, again, next Tuesday, in the chat. Thank you so much. Let me invite, for those who do have to drop, thank you for joining us. We loved having you as a part of the conversation. Come back next month. And otherwise, let's keep the questions going. I see one from Kwasi Fraser. Can I invite you to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, Kwasi Fraser, Mayor of the Town of Purcellville. Yeah, relative to this carbon sequestration, there are some municipalities with a lot of acreage of forest. How do you credit those municipalities for growing their forest and not having it go into development or over construction?
Yeah, so right now, I think that is an area of a lot of active study. There is a couple of carbon credit offset funds out there that invest in urban forests. I think the let's say the best one, in my opinion, is city forest credits, both in terms of how they get the third-party certification and how they translate the funds from the actual payment to the carbon offset into the people who are maintaining urban forests or replanting urban forests. They've been doing a lot of work in Seattle, actually, where Tina's worked. But there's not a robust diversity of those right now. One of the things that I think is maybe urban foresters are starting to think about is how they can advocate for investment in urban forestry from their cities as a carbon sink. And that's pretty new from a city planning perspective.
No, thank you, Chris.
That was a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Fraser. Other questions that participants have?
David Gatton had a question in the chat. David, are you still on?
I don't want to hog the questions here, but Tamar, do you have specific examples where private developers have paid into a sequestration fund for embodied carbon? Or is this a new idea, or am I showing my ignorance?
No, it's cutting edge right now. So we are just starting to see several cities in the US asking developers to pay in for operational carbon under the terms of Local Law 97, and the equivalent in Boston is BERDO, and the equivalent of Cambridge is BUDO, et cetera. But those still only pertain to operational carbon, and the city of Boston is right now exploring this as an option for embodied carbon from materials as well. So we're going to see it. You're right on the frontier there in the future.
There has been some individual projects where they have tried to invest in some sort of offsets. Usually it's when it's controlled by the same land of the developer so that they have a nice complete story within the project, mostly in Europe. One of the things about embodied carbon is that it's something that has just really been dived in the last maybe 5 to 10 years. And so think of how we plan and design for embodied carbon is like where stormwater green infrastructure was in the early 90s. So we're all still figuring it out. So what you're seeing more is that people are trying to study it. And that's what's cutting edge right now, is that they're trying to figure it out. So some cities like Toronto, in their new green building codes, is just asking people to start by studying it, just by reporting on it, with the idea that once they get comfortable enough with methods for reporting, then they can look into starting to regulate it. But it's
Boston's been doing that for about 5-10 years as well.
Could you envision a day when all products sold have a public right to know information on its embodied carbon content?
I would love that. And in fact, in Europe and a lot of the EN codes now, they're starting to push that farther and farther to be more and more common. So also in a lot of architectural circles, requiring EPDs, environmental product declarations, where they have the embodied carbon, is becoming very common in architecture. But it's sadly not common in landscape, primarily because we deal with a lot of bulk raw materials in landscape in comparison to architectural assemblies, which are more of a specified product. But I do think it is something that is coming down the road. That's also where I think cities in particular can take a lot of leadership by asking for EPDs. There are good ISO standards out there right now for how to develop an EPD. ISO 14044 and 45 are the two main ones that would apply for products in the United States. And there's a robust regulatory and third-party certification system out there. The problem is the market demand asking for companies to have those. And so that's where the gap is there. And I think part of it is literacy, that people don't know to ask for it in a large scale way. But the other part of it, I think, is regulatory.
But that's mostly in construction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. Sorry. That's a type.
Well, no, that's enough. I'm just,
So we're about 7 minutes over. I know people have very tight schedules. Wanted to definitely invite any of our speakers that need to jump off immediately to take this opportunity to do so. And then just sort of throw it open for maybe one or two quick last questions if anybody has burning questions that they want to ask of our speakers. I guess you can just drop them right in the chat. Okay, I think we're done. I think it's a good time to stop. So thank you again to all of our speakers, to all of our participants, and to Bloomberg Philanthropies for bringing us all together.
Thank
And
you.
we'll see you in January. Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thank you.
Thank